Hello and welcome to Module 6 of Info 200. My name is Andrew Che and I am the librarian for the School of Information here at San Jose State. And today's topic is research-based sources. Before we dive into the lesson, I want to give a brief overview of what we'll be covering. So first, we'll take a look at the information cycle, which will help us to define what research-based sources are and who creates them. Second, we'll be covering the types of research-based sources found in libraries. Third, we'll look at how information services have changed and how this has impacted the use of research-based sources. Fourth, we'll discuss evaluating research-based sources. And fifth, we'll take a look at some examples of research-based sources and how to find them. This will be covered in part 2, and hopefully it'll give you a clear picture of what to look for when it comes to your upcoming information sources survey assignment. So to start off, let's discuss the information cycle. The information cycle is essentially a timeline that explains the overall progression of when different types of information sources are created. So with this in mind, let's take a look at a visual example of the information cycle. In the slide, you can see that information sources can be separated into 5 different categories based on when they are usually created. To start off, once an event occurs, the information cycle begins. The first category is information sources that are created the same day that an event takes place. So here, social media, television, and radio are the main types of information sources. And at this stage, basic information about an event begins to emerge. A lot of the responses to the event may be highly emotional in nature. Interactions between online users of different platforms will be taking place. It might not be easy to separate fact from fiction, as there may be thousands of different social media posts in response to a single event, and there may be many conflicting accounts. For example, think of the sort of chaotic online environment that came about during the early days of the COVID-19 pandemic and all the different tweets, Instagram posts, and Facebook updates that you saw. Now, in the second category, information is released through newspapers the day or days after an event takes place. And in this stage, journalists begin reporting facts more thoroughly. While not everything will be completely accurate, facts will begin to be confirmed, and we start moving away from the sort of free-for-all that exists in the previous part of the information cycle. In the third category, weeks after an event occurs, you'll begin seeing magazines creating articles about the event. These will often include pieces that reflect on the event and provide a more in-depth level of analysis that really help to explain what the event means for society. And these pieces may also include short insights from experts in subject areas related to the event. In the fourth category, months and years after an event, scholarly articles are created. Here, scholars from many different academic disciplines and institutions will use frameworks and methodologies to really thoroughly analyze the event and write detailed, nuanced pieces. These articles are then peer-reviewed to ensure that the information in them is of a high quality. And lastly, a year or more after an event, books, reference sources, and government reports are created. These are made by scholars, professionals, and experts in their specific fields. Books often cover a variety of themes born out of highly detailed research, and the authors may try to weave together specific narratives. I should point out that books can be scholarly or popular in nature. Reference sources contain summaries and facts on specific topics. Government reports and publications are made by different committees and groups at all different levels of government, and the data they provide are often not found anywhere else and can help give a better understanding of policies and legislation. 2 important things to note about the information sources in the information cycle. The earlier parts of the information cycle result in information sources that are more popular in nature and are thus intended for a general audience. The latter stages of the information cycle result in information sources that are more often scholarly in nature. And because of this, they are usually intended for researchers, students, professionals, and people in the academic world. Now, this is not always the case. As mentioned earlier, books can be popular in nature even though they occur later in the information cycle. Another example is government reports. While these are likely to be used more often by academics and experts in specific fields, someone who is a part of the general audience may still be interested in reading them, perhaps out of curiosity or maybe a desire to be a better informed citizen. But again, in general, the earlier stages and latter stages of the information cycle result in sources that are significantly different from one another. Another way of looking at this is that a lot of the types of sources that are created in the latter parts of the information cycle can be viewed as authoritative. The Online Dictionary for Library and Information Science, or ODLIS for short, provides a really helpful definition for authoritative. It states that for something to be considered authoritative, it is a source that is official. Also, a work known to be reliable because its authenticity or integrity is widely recognized by experts in the field. So, if someone is looking for reliable information on hate crimes, for example, looking at an authoritative source that occurs late in the information cycle, such as the Encyclopedia of Race and Crime, is probably going to be more appropriate and helpful than something that occurs in the earlier stages of the information cycle, maybe something like a random Instagram post. Now, this does not mean that sources in the early stages of the information cycle are not useful. They certainly can be, and again, it depends on the context in which they are used. So, for example, a research project that's focused on analyzing people's conversations around a hate crime might focus on social media posts about the hate crime. Or, in another example, we do often need to rely on news from the media, especially in cases when catastrophic events occur, like wars, shootings, and wildfires. And all of this means that each type of information source in the information cycle has its own purpose and use. What we've looked at so far makes it clear that information sources can be extremely different depending on when they are created in the information cycle. So not all information sources will be appropriate for a user's information needs. As librarians, we need to be able to point users to appropriate information sources that will meet their specific needs. And having a knowledge of the information cycle can provide a solid foundation for us as we seek to do this. The importance of this can be seen in the American Library Association's Code of Ethics that guides the work that librarians do. The first principle in the Code of Ethics states, "We provide the highest level of service to all library users through appropriate and usefully organized resources, equitable service policies, equitable access, and accurate, unbiased, and courteous responses to all requests." Without an understanding of the information cycle and the different types of information sources that come from it, librarians would have a difficult time meeting the standards set for them in the first principle. Librarians would probably not be able to identify appropriate resources that are part of an accurate response to an information request. So, an understanding of the information cycle represents a foundational element of providing information services and meeting information needs. Okay, so now that we've looked at the information cycle, let's turn our attention to research-based information sources. So what exactly do we mean by a research-based source? Technically, any type of information source can be used for research, and we saw this earlier in the example of social media posts. being used in some research projects. However, here in Info 200, when we talk about research-based sources, we are primarily referring to reference sources. Let's take a look at a few helpful definitions from the Online Dictionary of Library Information Science. A reference source is any publication from which authoritative information can be obtained, including, but not limited to, reference books, catalog records, printed indexes, and abstracting services, and bibliographic databases. And a reference book is a book designed to be consulted when authoritative information is needed, rather than read cover to cover. A main point of emphasis here is that reference sources have authoritative information. So who creates these sources? As mentioned earlier, if something is authoritative, it's created by experts in their fields. So reference sources are created by experts who have extensive experience and knowledge related to their topics, made evident through things such as advanced degrees and specific accomplishments in their fields. In terms of the roles these experts have in the process of creating these reference sources, some are authors who contribute to the sources through written entries, as well as editors or peer reviewers who ensure the overall level of quality and reliability of the sources. I should also point out that reputable reference sources will usually be made by publishers who also have an extensive track record of producing information that is of a high quality. Some of the main reference sources that you'll come across in libraries, both in person and online, include almanacs, bibliographies, catalogs, chronologies, databases, directories, encyclopedias, indexes, guidebooks, and manuals. And these reference sources, again, provide authoritative information, and they can also be differentiated by their specific uses. So, for example, if you wanted to find an overview or summary of a specific topic or concept, an encyclopedia would be helpful, as it would provide a solid introduction that a researcher could build upon. If someone was looking for specific key facts, a source like an almanac or chronology would be useful. If you were looking for something that could help guide you to a wide variety of other sources that could be used during the course of your research, bibliography would be a great tool to use. One important thing that I should point out is that for your information sources survey assignment, you can also look at a few other types of sources other than standard reference sources when it comes to a research-based source for your information community. And these include academic peer-reviewed journals as a whole, so not individual articles, authoritative websites, and academic books. We'll go over some examples a bit later in part 2, but essentially these sources, like the reference sources we just looked at, occur later in the information cycle and contain authoritative information. All right, let's go over how information services have changed and how that has impacted research-based sources. Information sources have changed significantly over the years. If we were to take an in-depth look at this, it could really take up an entire course. And because of this, I'm going to focus on changes in two specific areas related to information services that have also had an impact on research-based sources. Now, the first one is changes in technology. And this probably won't come as a surprise to you, but with digital technologies being more widely used across society, there's been a growing emphasis on virtual services and e-resources in libraries. Abram makes an excellent point when he explains how these types of changes in society and technology are occurring much more quickly than they used to. And as a result of this, libraries have to be well prepared to adapt at any given moment. On a related note, Cassell and Hieramath note a few requirements that libraries must have in order to meet information needs. First, libraries must have the necessary technology to reach their users and communities. Second, librarians must have the skills and ability to apply and use that technology to provide information services and resources that meet people's needs. And third, libraries must focus on the overall usability of their technology, resources, and services. The pandemic really amplified the importance of technology and adapting according to user needs. Since people in a lot of areas couldn't physically enter their libraries, librarians began offering virtual programs. Some libraries started or expanded their online chat services, while a lot of libraries offered pickup services for physical books. Libraries also made sure to highlight to their communities all of the ebooks and e-resources that they offered. Here I have some pictures that show some ways in which our library has been recently reaching out to users. The picture on the left shows a sticker that has been placed on a lot of desks in the library. And this is an example of how the library has really put an emphasis on ensuring that students know where to find resources to get help. The picture on the right shows an empty reference desk. While we still had librarians on the reference desk during the past school year, the stats over the past year showed that a vast majority of users went to our online chat service to receive research assistance. And as a result of this, the library is adapting by having librarians focus more on offering virtual reference services as opposed to being at a physical reference desk. The changes in technology both before and during the pandemic have had an effect on reference sources, as many libraries have made a point to focus on the digital versions of these. Here I have a picture of a set of the Dictionary of National Biography that I took at King Library, as well as a screenshot of the current digital version of this resource that we have. In some libraries, maybe even your own local library, you may find that the physical reference collections are dwindling or perhaps no longer take up any space on the library shelves. During the pandemic, one of my local libraries got rid of a majority of their physical reference collection. And this trend is likely to continue as a lot of library users find that using reference sources, where they're looking for specific information like summaries of topics and key facts, is easier to do and overall more convenient in an online format. A second change that I'd like to focus on is that information literacy has become an increasingly important component of the information services that libraries provide. Let's first define what information literacy actually is. One definition comes from way back in 1989 when the ALA Presidential Committee on Information Literacy said, "To be information literate, a person must be able to recognize when information is needed and have the ability to locate, evaluate, and use effectively the needed information." The Association of College and Research Libraries also provides a useful definition in its framework for information literacy for higher education, and it states, "Information literacy is the set of integrated abilities encompassing the reflective discovery of information, the understanding of how information is produced and valued, and the use of information in creating new knowledge and participating ethically in communities of learning." So together, the definitions make it clear that finding information isn't the only important part of information literacy. Instead, we need to approach information in a holistic way, where we also understand how it's created, whether it's good or bad information, and how it can be used effectively. Let's dig a little deeper into this. One of the core responsibilities of librarians has traditionally been to help users find information. This is still very, very important. However, librarians in the modern era often take on a much more active role. In addition to providing books or other resources, many librarians now engage in providing information literacy services to users by teaching them how to search for, evaluate, and use information resources in effective ways. The importance of this is made clear when one considers all of the different sources of information that exist these days. And by that, I mean both good and bad information. You'll learn more about misinformation in Module 10, but for now, I just want to point out a few things. These days, people can find a wide variety of information when using Google and other search engines. And in a sense, this really is the Wild West where anyone can say or write anything, and there's a fairly good chance that someone will believe it regardless of its reliability. Also, consider social media. While social media has allowed us to connect with one another and sometimes gain access to key pieces of information, it's also led to a really alarming increase in the number of people believing things that are not based in facts or reality at all. So, how does this all connect to reference sources? Well, reference sources provide a really stark contrast to a lot of the unreliable sources of information that continue to increase. In an article that connects the use of reference sources to various parts of the Association of College and Research Libraries Information Literacy Framework, Kristen Green states, "With the advent of ease to which individuals can create and disseminate information, there is an even greater obligation for people to understand how to find and learn from reference sources that provide factual information." So librarians can help in this whole process by teaching students and community members to access and use reference sources in a way that can strengthen their information literacy. For example, let's take a look at one of the 6 frames in ACRL's information literacy framework and how Green specifically connects it to reference sources. The first frame states that authority is constructed and contextual. A couple of key takeaways from this. People who are in the process of becoming information literate should think about where authority comes from, such as an author being a subject expert or being in a certain position of power, and they should analyze if a source is in fact credible. Using reference sources can help show an individual how authority is constructed. For example, the authority of encyclopedia entries comes from somewhere. Using and analyzing encyclopedias can help show library users that these authoritative entries are built upon previous sources of knowledge. And this can help show that authority on a topic doesn't simply appear out of thin air, and that it is in fact constructed. I should note here that Green offers a lot of additional great insights into the role of reference sources in both information literacy as well as the information search process. So Green's article is definitely worth reading. So let's switch gears and go over evaluating research-based sources. There are multiple factors to consider when evaluating information sources, including research-based sources. You'll be using these in your information sources survey assignment, and you'll likely use these at some point in your future careers as librarians and information professionals, so it's important to understand what they are. First, the position within the information cycle. As we discussed earlier, the position of the information cycle in which a source is created will have a really significant impact on what kind of information is found in the source and whether or not it will be suitable for a user's specific information needs. Again, one type of source is not necessarily better than another. For example, while a tweet may not necessarily be a reliable source of information, a researcher may need to look at a large number of tweets if they are researching something such as trends in online hate speech. In terms of authoritative research-based sources, though, you'll want to look at sources that are created later in the information cycle. Second, scope and content. Here we're looking at how much information a source has on a certain topic. So in other words, the overall breadth of coverage. The type of source that something is will have a clear impact on this. So for example, it's more likely that something like a government report will contain more detailed information about COVID-19 than a Facebook post on the same topic. We also need to consider what type of content is in the source. So is the information source scholarly or popular in nature? Is it educational or commercial? Third, authority. When looking at an information source, it's really important to look at who the author or creator is. We should consider the credentials of an author, like their degrees and where they studied, as well as their overall background in terms of what they've written and published. In addition, we can look at the reputation and history of the publisher. Different publishers may have extensive histories of publishing in specific subject areas, reading levels, etc. Sage Publishing, for example, is known as an extremely reputable publisher when it comes to reference works. In addition, we should look at whether there were editors or peer reviewers to ensure the reliability of the information produced. Fourth, purposes and uses. Here you want to consider what are the reasons why an information source has been created. Did the authors intend for the readers to use and apply their information in specific ways? And related to that is the fifth point, intended audience. Who was this information source created for? Who does it specifically cater to? If an information source is geared towards a scholarly audience, it may have a different level of effectiveness if it's read by someone who is looking solely for popular materials. Sixth, design. The design of an information source can impact its overall effectiveness. Consider the differences between electronic versus physical versions of the same information source. Also, are there specific design features that can have a positive or negative impact on users? For example, I'm sure we've all looked at websites that were difficult to navigate through, and that may have caused us to not get the information that we were looking for. Seventh, currency. Because of the hyper-connected society and world that we live in, new information surrounding an event or topic often comes up. While this doesn't always cause previous information to become fully obsolete, it is important to consider how new information impacts our understanding of an event or topic. Just think of all the different information that we've received about COVID-19 throughout the pandemic. Clearly, what we knew about the virus in the early days of 2020 has now evolved into a much more complete understanding of how the virus spreads and how to effectively protect ourselves. Some information sources are updated on a regular basis and others are not. This can have a clear impact on the overall usefulness of an information source. So for example, if you're looking at an encyclopedia of American history that is from 1990, you'll be missing out on a lot of key events and concepts that have developed over the past few decades. While not all topics will have research-based sources that have been released in the recent past, you do want to try to find the most up-to-date sources as they will be able to provide the most current information on a topic. And finally, biases and gaps. This is also connected to the idea of looking at the background of the authors and publishers of an information source. With some information sources, it's not too difficult to identify a possible bias. If you're looking at certain groups and individuals on social media, Many of these will have a clear bias, such as advocating for certain political or religious views, maybe promoting a product or brand. While it may be less likely for research-based sources to have clear biases and gaps, it's still important to identify them if they do exist, as this can obviously impact the information in the final product. When it comes to gaps, not all information sources will cover every possible part of a topic that a user might need, so it is important to identify what is in fact missing. In one of your readings for this week, Sarah Franks also points out the possibility of information sources excluding the voices of certain people, and this is important specifically for reference sources. Again, they are, in general, viewed as giving authoritative information, such as summaries and facts on a topic. Now, think about how this might possibly impact, for example, marginalized communities, whose voices have often been historically left out of the picture. So, having looked at the main factors to consider in evaluating sources, let's explore a bit more why it's important to evaluate research-based sources in the first place. Or I should ask, why is it important really to evaluate any type of information source? This is related to what I addressed earlier in the lecture with regard to the importance of the information cycle and how that can be connected to ALA's Code of Ethics. An additional framework here that can help us to gain a deeper understanding of evaluating information sources is the professional competencies for reference and user services librarians created by the Reference and User Services Association, also known as RUSA, which is a division of the American Library Association. So RUSA has listed multiple competencies, but I'm going to focus on 3 key ones. These competencies, when viewed as a whole, help to make it very clear as to why librarians need to be able to evaluate research-based sources. Let's take a look at them. A librarian assesses and responds to diversity in user needs, user communities, and user preferences, accesses relevant and accurate recorded knowledge and information, evaluates, collects, retrieves, and synthesizes information from diverse sources. When looking at all 3 of these, it is important to note that they do not necessarily always occur in a linear fashion. But the competencies help show that information communities have many unique information needs, and after assessing these specific needs, librarians must be able to find and access potential information resources that can meet these needs. Librarians must also evaluate these information sources. Evaluating research-based sources and other information sources can help librarians to determine if the sources will in fact be useful for users and if they are good quality sources. The process of evaluating information sources is essential because skipping it can negate what is accomplished through assessing information needs and accessing relevant information. The importance of these different competencies can be connected to Fisher and Fulton's characteristics of information communities. Here, I'm going to focus on the second characteristic, which is the capacity to form around people's needs to access and use information. The 3 RUSA competencies that we just looked at can guide librarians as they seek to assist individuals who are a part of information communities. When librarians engage in the actions described in these competencies, they are helping connect individuals in these communities to essential information sources. Research-based sources are one key component in this as they, again, in general, provide authoritative, reliable information that individuals can build upon and also combine with other types of information sources that, as a whole, can strengthen the information communities they are part of, by helping their members gain access to and use information. So just to recap, we've covered the information cycle and where research-based sources fall in the information cycle. We've looked at research-based sources in libraries and how recent changes in information services have impacted them. And we've also looked at the importance of evaluating research-based sources. In part 2, we're going to look at some ways that you can go about finding research-based sources. This will build upon what we've covered in this first part. If you have any questions about what's been covered so far, please feel free to reach out to your professor or me. Now let's move on to part 2.